Hi everyone, this is Meredith Hutchison Hartley with the Hidden History of Business podcast. Before we get this episode started, I just wanted to take a second, one, to thank you for listening, but also to apologize because you're going to hear a little bit of noise distortion during this episode. We record most of our episodes in the conference room of our office space, and it turns out that one of our neighbors was running a large print job during that time, and we didn't realize that some of those vibrations were being picked. So even though we were able to remove the majority of it, our voices do sound a little echoey and distorted. Luckily, we've already found a fix, so this shouldn't be a problem in future episodes, but I did want to give you a heads up and apologize for that in advance. We have loved reading feedback from our listeners on iTunes, our Facebook page, and Twitter under our handle @HiddenBiz, and we've really appreciated the feedback you've given us on our sound quality. One of the struggles of running a podcast like this is that there are three of us, and we're all in the room at the same time when we do a group episode. That's really important to us, that we're recording a real conversation that we're having live together. But it's also really difficult balancing that sound for the three of us, and then that problem is magnified because everyone's listening on a slightly different device. So we have really appreciated the feedback you've given us. And a couple of you have said that you didn't want to be hypercritical about the sound. Please be hypercritical. We love feedback, including the stuff that we can do better. So if you want to head on over to iTunes or to our Facebook page and leave us a review, tell us what you like, tell us what you think we could do better, give us an example. We would really appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening, and let's jump right into the episode. Welcome back. I'm Meredith Hutchison Hartley.
I'm Frank Hutchison.
And I'm Emily Geddes.
And welcome to the Hidden History of Business podcast.
So this afternoon, I was in the car, and as I often do, I had NPR on the radio. And it was just kind of an offhand mention that caught my attention. The reporter talked about how certain professions are disappearing, and the one that she mentioned in particular was bounty hunters. So, as I often do when I am intrigued by a random comment on NPR, I went home and I started doing a little bit of research on this, looking at bounty hunting in particular and why it was disappearing, as well as some other fields that were disappearing. And that led me down this fascinating rabbit hole of the history of bounty hunting that started in the 13th century in England, when a person who was named as the custodian of the accused was collateral in case they didn't show up to appear at trial. Then that custodian would suffer the punishment instead of the accused. Over time, it has morphed into financial rather than a person as collateral. At this present time, the United States is one of only 2 countries, I believe, that has financial bail as consideration, which I find very interesting because it's actually specifically mentioned in our Bill of Rights as well. So it's pretty well entrenched in our American tradition and society. But with changes in the industry, with
Dog the Bounty Hunter,
reality shows, concerns about legalities in different jurisdictions, concerns about excessive force, concerns about the criminalization of the poor, high bail amounts where people who can afford to pay the bail don't have to stay in jail, and people who can't afford do have to stay in jail, so essentially they're being punished for the crime before they're even tried. There are a lot of changes going on in the industry, which is why this mention on NPR about bounty hunting as an industry possibly disappearing. So then I got looking at other industries that might be disappearing. And the Department of Labor has a Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they put out reports on all sorts of fascinating, interesting bits of information. But I was looking specifically at the most rapidly declining industries. And of the top 15, all but 2 are manufacturing. I don't think that would be a really big surprise to anybody who's been paying attention for a while, because there's a lot of chatter about our offshore exporting our manufacturing jobs.
Although a big part of it, the decline in manufacturing, is because we don't need as many people. We're a lot more productive because of automation and increased mechanization.
But there's also a significant amount of outsourcing to other countries going on.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And that got me thinking about the different reasons that different professions, different industries start to disappear. With bounty hunting, it has a lot of different factors with social justice issues, with regulation, with manufacturing, like you mentioned, exporting and keeping costs down by shipping those jobs overseas. But we got looking at what some of the other causes might be and some other examples. these disappearing industries and professions.
Well, which is not a new development. All throughout history, there have been industries that seemed completely solid, that they would last forever, who disappeared nearly overnight in some cases.
Right.
That's true. For example, it used to be that if you took a picture, you would end up having to take this canister with the film in it to the local drugstore or a camera shop and have the film developed, and then you go back and you pick up your pictures and you get to sort through them. And that was really neat. In fact, Eastman Kodak was built, that empire was built on the film industry.
And now we were in the middle of a move, and my kids found a little canister of film that I hadn't developed, and they couldn't figure out what it was. I had them spend about 5 minutes trying to guess what it was. They thought it was a battery. They thought that it might be a secret rocket. I mean, they're 6 and 7. They had some pretty crazy ideas to it. When I told them that that's how we took pictures, they looked at it and they want to know how you plugged it into a computer.
Yes.
So one reason that industries and professions disappear is simply because the technology moves beyond them.
It does.
It does. And a good example of that is an example I use in my classes. I always tell people that if you go back to the year that Henry Ford introduced the Model T, I would bet that buggy whip manufacturers were saying, this is the best year yet. It's only going to get better. Future is bright. How many buggy whip manufacturers are there today? There's still a few, but they're very niche, and they're for a very special small population. Another good example of this is back in the 90s, I got to work in the Pentagon for several years. While there, I also happened to pick up some of the history. The Pentagon was built in 1941, just at the beginning of World War II, because the Department of War needed more space, more office space. So they built the Pentagon, which is still the largest office building in the world. At the time that it was built, it was designed to hold roughly 25,000 people. About 80% of those 25,000 people, about 20,000 of them, were clerk typists or records clerks.
Wow.
The Pentagon was basically a big filing cabinet. Now, in the 90s, that was 50 years after it was built, I never remember ever seeing a clerk typist in the entire building. They had disappeared entirely. That doesn't mean that they didn't exist. The lieutenants, the captains, the majors, and even the colonels had become the clerk typists. They were typing on their computers. Everybody had the computer, and everybody was typing their own reports on the computer. And you see this now happening in the medical profession. There are still advertisements for medical transcriptionists, but the industry is changing to point of entry. The doctor's there with the patient, they're entering their notes directly into the computer. They don't need transcriptionists anymore. So transcriptionists are probably going to go away as well.
At least in large numbers.
Yes.
Well, between point of entry and, once again, technology advancements, you've got voice recognition software.
Yes.
Yep.
All these are happening to change what used to be a very good profession for people. Not anymore.
Well, I mean, you can see technology really played a role in that. And Emily, you were talking about an example with telephones.
Oh, yeah. This story actually kind of makes me giggle. It's that whole necessity being the mother of invention idea. There was a man named Almond Strauger. I'm making up that pronunciation.
Sure.
So let's go with it.
I mean, we researched it very carefully and we're certain of it, right?
That's what I
Yes,
meant.
absolutely.
Say it with confidence. Almond Strauger was an undertaker in Kansas City, Missouri, and he noticed that his business was declining rather suddenly, and he couldn't figure out why. He had a friend who had passed away, and he hadn't been called about the funeral services, so he started trying to figure out why. And he discovered that one of the telephone operators in town was the wife of one of his competitors. So when she was getting phone calls for the undertaker, she was funneling them all to her husband rather than spreading them around or sending any to his competitors. So Strauger became understandably upset and decided to invent an automatic switching telephone that would not require the intervention of a person in between the caller and the person they were trying to reach.
That's awesome.
And what we're talking about is the old stereotype of the woman sitting at this big switchboard with pulling the plugs and putting all the wires in place.
Right.
And instead, it all be done automatically.
Wow.
Exactly. They went from the manual telephone exchange operators to that position being unnecessary because Strauger invented an automatic telephone
Well,
exchange.
and what irony. I mean, in trying to tank a competitor, you actually give them the motivation to create the technology that would destroy her own job.
Makes you obsolete.
Yes.
Absolutely.
That's hilarious.
But then you look at how we don't have that kind of telephone operator anymore, but often when you call a business,
Or a very large
office,
corporation,
a large corporation, you will still reach an operator. And they often have those mind-numbing telephone trees.
which are starting to really irritate customers.
Definitely. But you're getting back to, you still have to talk to a real person at some point. I know at my doctor's office, when you call, you get an operator who can direct you to which department. And having that personal touch has been a benefit for some businesses. So you can see that how this profession is kind of, it went away, it morphed a little bit, it's changed as a result of technology, as a result of invention, as a result of personal
But now it's starting to come
issues.
back, and it's in a new format.
There's also social impact here. In fact, your great-grandmother met your great-grandfather while he was working on one of those switchboards.
I don't know that story. What?
He was underneath, and she was there. She was a telephone operator, and someone said, "Hey, Emily, you got to meet this guy." So all she saw was his legs sticking out, and so he came out, and the rest was history. It was. Yes, that's a little family history there.
I think what we're hearing a lot of these stories is that even though the job may go away in a specific format, the need doesn't, which means there's always potential for something to be resurrected or adapted in a new way to apply to a different circumstance. And my favorite example of that is the cymbal maker Zildjian, which was based out of the Ottoman Empire. Basically, back in 1618, an alchemist named Geddes was trying to turn base metal into gold. And he accidentally stumbled upon this alloy of tin and copper and silver, which could be turned into a sheet metal that made musical sounds without shattering. This was so significant because the Ottomans used cymbals as noisemakers in battle. They would crash them to disorient their enemies as the cavalry and the soldiers rushed in. But the problem with most of the metals they used is that after a few uses, they would shatter in battle. So you'd be left with this broken cymbal you couldn't use anymore. That's why Geddes' discovery was so revolutionary. And by just 5 years later, 1623, he controlled the market to the point that the Sultan gave him the last name Zildjian, which means cymbalsmith. And the recipe was not written down. He passed it as a secret from father to son, and this went on for generations. For about 200 years, they made the cymbals for the Ottoman Empire. But in the 1800s, the technology was changing. Artillery technology had advanced, and cymbals were becoming less popular. But right around the same time, a bunch of European composers wanted to start using cymbals in their operas. Just like we discussed in some of our other podcasts about Turkey and food naming, that the Ottoman Empire was the height of exoticism. So as they were writing these operas about Esther or Nabucco, they wanted to use cymbals to evoke that feeling. Or similar to a modern composer wanting to use a Japanese lute or a certain kind of pipe to evoke a certain sound if they're doing an opera. So they wanted to incorporate these cymbals. So they wanted to get the best, so they started contacting Zildjian because they found that there was better consistency, that they could control the tone better, and it reached the point that Wagner insisted on only using Zildjian cymbals in his orchestra. Within 60 years, they were standard in every single orchestra, and everyone wanted them from Zildjian. They started traveling to international trade shows. I mean, they were completely controlling the market until suddenly in 1868, they nearly went bankrupt. They suffered a series of fires, and they couldn't recover quickly enough. And they were considering moving to Paris because they figured they could have some financiers there, but they really didn't want to leave their homeland. And at that point, they got a bailout. The Sultan said, let's do anything we need to do to keep this company here. And just like the auto industry and other folks have received, this was the 1800s equivalent of a government bailout. So they were able to survive and rebuild. Then the political turmoils of the 1900s came along, and some of the leaders of Zildjian, which had still been passed down father to son, in some cases father to nephew, they started sympathizing with the Armenian liberation movement, and that didn't go over so well. So in the early 1900s, the leader at the time, Zildjian, had to flee to Bucharest because of his political affiliations. But the plus of being in Bucharest is they could start exporting to the United States, which was now the largest consumer of cymbals in the world. And after about 20 years, Aram decided to write to his nephew Geddes, who was a descendant of the original founder. This is one of the cases where Aram descended from the nephew, but Geddes had opened a candy factory in the United States. Aram said, "Hey, Geddes, can we come there? We want to come and open up a cymbal factory in the United States. It's the majority of our business now. Let's open a foundry." And 2 years later, in 1929, the beginning of the Great Depression, right before the market crashed, Zildjian moved to the United States. And you would think that would be a recipe for disaster, that they would immediately collapse. But they opened a foundry in Massachusetts, and they exploded. They became insanely popular because they timed their arrival. They couldn't have done it better. The Jazz Age began in the United States. They happened to meet a man named Gene Krupa. I don't know if you recognize the name. He became really pretty famous. You might know Gene Krupa from the song Sing, Sing, Sing. That was what his band did. He was a great band leader during the Jazz Age. And he recognized the value of the cymbal. And he connected Geddes and Aram with the developers of the drum set. This was just when the drum set was actually being combined. Before that, you had a bunch of separate drums. And someone was finally putting them together into this system that a single person could sit and work on. And they said, "Hey, it'd be really great if we could put cymbals onto our drum sets, but they're too heavy right now." And Geddes said, "Well, we can work on that." So they worked in close cooperation with these drum specialists, these percussion specialists, to create a thinner cymbal that would meet their needs. And that's why we have cymbals on drum sets, is because Zildjian partnered with them. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been as iconic. Now, the byproduct of that is that everyone heard how awesome it was to work with Geddes. And they said, "Hey, we want to work with you too." So they started coming to him saying, "Hey, I love that cymbal, but I want to sound a little more like this or a little more like that." Now, Geddes had been discriminated against in his own childhood. He was an Armenian living in Turkey, and he'd experienced a lot of ethnic discrimination. So in the 30s, he vowed that there would be no discrimination in the Zildjian company. So he made it a priority to work with Black American musicians. And you'll see he worked with Duke Ellington, Chick Webb, Papa Joe Jones, and they developed these different sounds. You can go to our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com, and you can hear examples of some of these sounds, like the paper-thin crash, which is that really, really high crash on a cymbal, the ride, the splash, the hi-hat, the sizzle. All of these were developed and named by Geddes. And then Gene Krupa came back, and he held these epic drum battles with Buddy Rich, who was another drummer at Carnegie Hall. They would actually pair up and they would drum and compete with each other. And these were iconic in the 50s and 60s. That helped spread again the popularity of the cymbal. But during World War II, again, they nearly got shut down because metal was rationed. And if you don't have metal, you can't make cymbals. But the U.S. government, just like in the 1800s when the Sultan came and bailed them out, said, "Wait a second, we need cymbals for our military bands. We need to have that morale." So Zildjian began by making cymbals for the Sultan, for the military itself, and they've kind of come full circle now where the U.S. government is keeping them alive so they can continue making musical cymbals for them. And World War II was the first time they broke tradition. They wrote down the recipe, which previously had only been passed father to son, or nephew, or male relatives down, because they had to provide the U.S. government with a request for rationed metal. So they survived World War II. They became even more famous in the 50s through these drum battles. And then the new CEO came in, and he opened their first research and development center, where they took these same things they'd learned working with jazz age musicians, and they applied them to the Boston Philharmonic. They created these centers where you could come in and you could play with different cymbals and find exactly the right sound you wanted, which is what they'd been doing with the composers in Europe in the 1800s too. They continued that tradition of closely working and getting feedback until they dominated the market even further. And just in the last 20 years, they've broken tradition again. They've pivoted and adapted. After 16 generations, they finally passed from father to daughter. In fact, now the CEO and vice president are both women who are deeply involved in the process, who are passionate, and are still passing on that tradition. Now, at any point, they could have fallen completely apart. They could have disappeared, but they found ways to pivot. And I think really the key there is feedback, just like we see with the operators. Just as these companies are getting feedback that people don't like the automated system, so they're bringing in more human operators, Zildjian got human feedback, which let them pivot and survive in this extremely volatile market. They've been around for almost 400 years now. which is amazing when you consider how all the ways that they could have fallen apart over those years.
I've got one more example of
Yeah.
a company kind of pivoting like that that I find really interesting. Back in the 1930s, a soap manufacturer named Cleo McVickers invented a wallpaper cleaner. And back in the 30s, most heat was coal-powered heat. When you burned the coal, you would get residue in your home. That's a lot of what spring cleaning came from.
That's
It
right.
would be after your house had been closed up all winter long, you would want to open everything up. You'd want to scrub all the coal residue out of the house. So he created this wallpaper cleaner that was this kind of putty that you could use to get the coal residue off of the wallpaper. But following World War II, coal started decreasing as a source for home heat for the most part. It transferred to natural gas and some other sources.
Electricity.
And electricity, absolutely. Wallpaper also became more vinyl-based and easier to wash. So the market for this wallpaper cleaning putty was going downhill. They weren't quite sure what to do about this until his nephew, Joe McVicker, discovered that this wallpaper cleaner, this putty, was being used by school children to make Christmas ornaments. So they repackaged it and marketed it as an educational tool to schools as Play-Doh.
Oh, no way.
Yes.
Yes, as Play-Doh. About the 1950s or so. So they had 20 years of this product being used for its original purpose as a wallpaper cleaner. The market was declining because of, again, changes in technology, changes in society, and so they looked at what people were using it for and discovered this whole new market in educational school supplies.
Feedback.
Yeah, and I mean, every kid nowadays has Play-Doh or has played with Play-Doh at some point or other.
Well, yeah, again, we're seeing that feedback is critical for pivoting.
And what you quite often find is that people will develop a product thinking that it's going to be used one way, and then someone else comes along and finds an entirely different use for it.
That makes me think of the song Toot Sweets from
Oh,
Chitty Chitty Bang
yes.
Bang.
Yes.
This is the delightful candy that you can whistle with, right? And it ended up at the end of the movie being a dog treat
Yes.
because that was
How you call the dog.
Exactly.
That's right. If you'd like to learn more about the companies and examples we've discussed in this episode, head on over to our website, www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com, where you'll find links to articles. We'll even have a video of Gene Krupa rocking out to Sing, Sing, Sing. And you can also hit up our Facebook page, The Hidden History of Business, or contact us on Twitter. Our handle is @HiddenBiz. That's @HiddenBiz. And please head on over to iTunes or our Facebook page and leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much for listening.